Hi, everyone. Welcome to Webinar Wednesdays with the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and the California Strategic Growth Council. My name is Eric DeCock, Program Manager for Planning and Community Development at OPR. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. The subject of today's webinar is our Fire Hazard Planning Technical Advisory, an update that we have in progress. We have released a public draft of this document a little over a week ago, and so the purpose of today's webinar is really to go through this technical advisory, present it to you, and answer any questions or comments that folks might have, at least at this early stage in the public review process. With us today is Kate Gordon, Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, as well as some other key staff who you'll hear from later. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Kate, who's going to welcome us and give some introductory framing remarks for us today. So take it away, Kate. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Eric. And I am not, in fact, in front of the Capitol. I am talking to you from ancestral Ohlone land in Berkeley, California. So I really appreciate the ability to do that. And that is relevant because the contribution of Native Californians to our fire landscape has been incredibly important and continues to be to this day. So we can start with that next slide. Fire is, as I think folks know, just a critically important part of California's landscape and has been for a long time. It's a natural part of our landscape. Slightly off topic, but I realized today, because I was looking into this for another reason, that, and this was amazing to me, only 6% of the land in California is actually developed. So 40 million Californians live on 6% of the land. About 46% is federally owned, 25% is agricultural, and another part is privately owned and state-owned forests. But in any case, natural working land and fire are a natural part of our landscape. Indigenous practices developed over many millennia are based on the reality of fire, and that included prescribed burning, other landscape management practices using sort of traditional ecological knowledge. That changed over the past couple of centuries. Colonization of the state, but then the growth of the timber industry really led to fire suppression being kind of part of our fire management strategy, often at the expense of more holistic land management practices, including prescribed burning. And that shift in treatment of our forests and forest management left our state extremely vulnerable to growing climate impacts. Climate change, there's a reason that we called it global warming for a long time. Really, the fundamental impact of climate change is increased temperatures, and what happens with increased temperatures are a variety of impacts, right? But really important to California, what we get are wetter wet years, drier dry years. So in the dry years, we see a drying out of vegetation. In the wet years, we see a growth of vegetation. We also see earlier snow melt from increased heat, and all those things together have exacerbated the hazards and the risks faced by Californians from fire. And so that combination of fire management practices changing and climate change has really just put us in an incredibly high risk situation. Can we go to the next slide? The context is stark. I mean, I think this chart is pretty stark. I remember the governor was elected in his first week of being the governor-elect. He was the lieutenant governor, and Governor Brown left the state. And so Lieutenant Governor Newsom was in charge, and the Camp Fire happened that week that he was put in charge of the state. And we thought that was the worst year. And then in 2019, his first week of being governor, PG&E declared bankruptcy. The ratings agencies downgraded all of our utilities, and we thought that was the worst fire season. And now this year, we see actually 6 of the largest wildfires in state history this year, more acreage burned than at any other time. And actually, I just found out this morning that 2 new fires have started on the Nevada coast as of yesterday. So we have a fire season that's just extending extremely far into the winter. We have spent $1 billion of our state budget on fire management, fighting this year. That's $650 million over budget just on personnel and machines. So this is really, really a significant issue. And you can really see that here. This is all happening with the context, and we're going to talk about that mostly today, of population growth and development pressure. So what we call the wildland urban interface, or the WUI footprint of the state, is this growing interface between our kind of traditionally developed parts of the state and our wilder parts of the state. 11 million Californians live in that band of land. So that's a quarter of the state's population lives in the WUI. A lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is in high fire risk and high fire hazard severity zones. Many of those communities are at risk. And so generally what WUI means is development near wildlands that can be urban or suburban or exurban, and some rural and undeveloped areas. It can take a lot of different forms. It does not look the same, but in general, it's this sort of broad category of that interface. We've seen a lot of development growth in the WUI. I know folks on the call know that. That's been due to all kinds of things. Affordable housing pressures. Development is easier in greenfields than it is in infill areas still. At this point, close to half the housing in California that's been built since the early 1990s has been in the WUI. That is why we see the kinds of damages and losses and, frankly, the toxic smoke issues that we see from the fires in California today. Is because of the sheer amount of development. When you have that much development, you're asking our utilities to then put in power grid to serve that development, combine that with high fire risk and high wind events, and it has created this unsustainable situation. Those buildings can become fuel to spread the fire. Embers from those buildings are moving very quickly under wind-driven events. So we're just seeing a far greater set of impacts than we did before. So what does all that mean, and why are we here today? It means that planners are on the front lines, frankly, of thinking about how to manage wildfires in the state of California. We need a planning and policy framework for wildfire resilience. We are hoping that the technical assistance we'll talk about today really builds into that. Fire suppression is not an answer anymore. We need a more holistic and a more adaptive approach that takes climate change into account. Planners need to ask themselves, in a future with increasingly severe wildfires due to climate change and due to development patterns for the last 30 years, have we done enough? Are our plans adequate? Are they working? And most important, what will it take to make our communities fire adapted, more resilient, and to make California more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive going into the future? So those are the key questions. They are not easy questions. And I'll turn it back to Eric with just a quick note to say, such a big thank you to Eric and also Beth Hotchkiss for all the work they did on this technical assistance. OPR is very small and mighty, and we do a lot with very few staff, and they have really been exceptional in this process. So I just wanted to give them a quick thank you and turn it back to Eric.
Thank you so much, Kate, for the welcoming remarks and the great overview of our challenges here in California with wildfire and the management of this hazard and the risks that we face in a climate-constrained future. Why don't we go ahead to the next slide, Alyssa, and we'll begin the overview of our fire hazard planning technical advisory. Hopefully many of you saw that we did release this last week. It's part of our general plan technical advice series. The purpose of a technical advisory is to really supplement our general plan guidelines, but this technical advisory on the subject of fire hazard planning, while it does give some supplemental advice on general plans, it does get into some planning guidance that's more holistic and looks at other planning tools and ways to integrate work that can be done in the general plan with other planning mechanisms and implementation aspects of those plans in a lot of local governance activities. So with that, next slide, please. This technical advisory is being updated pursuant to, there were two bills that were passed in 2018. We have SB 901 and we have Assembly Bill 2911, which called for OPR to update this technical advisory with a very specific purpose in mind, which was to include specific land use strategies to reduce fire risks to buildings, infrastructure, and communities. So, and of course, we not only have to update it this year, but we need to update the guidance at least once every 8 years or so. So that was the charge under the bill. This, like I said, this technical advice document does provide expanded guidance on the general plan, and it is intended to really illustrate the realm of the possible with fire hazard planning as it relates to hazards and what must be addressed in the general plan. Next slide, please. So this image on the screen here really just kind of gets out one of the key pieces in the document. The overview that Kate gave is actually a great encapsulation of sort of the definition of the problem. We do have a new section of that, which you already heard from Kate on that piece. The next key section of the document really talks about the sort of the regulatory and the policy background. And I'm not going to read everything on the screen because it's a lot. And it's a great little diagram that sort of shows the connections between federally mandated or federally designed programs and policies that can support wildfire hazard and resilience work. We have state level work that's being done by CAL FIRE and a number of different agencies, but primarily through CAL FIRE on the regulatory pieces that are in play for lands that are in the state, what we call the state responsibility and very high fire hazard severity zone. And those do relate to the general plan and the safety element, which we'll talk about. We also have CEQA requirements and other regulatory tools like the fire safe regulations and defensible space regs. And I think the point here is that there's a lot of pieces that are part of the bigger puzzle of how local agencies can be addressing and reducing wildfire risk. And it's not necessarily just one plan or one tool. They all sort of work and need to be aligned. And that'll be a theme that you hear from us today as we go through the presentation. Next slide, please. So our general plans, just a little general plan 101 for those who might be new to what a general plan is. California state law does require that each city or county adopt a general plan, which outlines a vision for how a community will grow and change over time. And it should reflect community priorities and the values of a community. It expresses goals, objectives, and implementation measures. And it really serves as the blueprint for how a community will grow and change moving forward. As you can see on the screen here, there are sort of nine mandatory elements or topics that must be in a general plan, ranging from land use, circulation, housing, conservation, open space, noise. We've highlighted safety because at least on a statutory basis, the legal requirement for a general plan, wildfire is the safety element is the place where wildfire must be addressed. Of course, there are interconnecting issues, which we'll talk about today, where wildfire can be addressed throughout other elements of the general plan. We'll specifically be talking today about land use, housing, conservation, open space, and circulation, and even in some cases, environmental justice and what the implications are for reducing wildfire risk across those different topics as well. Next slide, please. The safety element in particular, just to kind of go over what's required in a general plan today as it relates to wildfire. First and foremost, wildfire must be addressed, again, for all cities and counties who have lands that are within the state responsibility area, or what we call the very high fire hazard severity zone. The state as a whole is mapped into a series of fire hazard severity zones ranging from moderate, high, and very high. So the very high category, if you have lands in that zone, you must address wildfire as well in the local responsibility area. Now these requirements for wildfire, and we're not going to get into every single aspect of the requirements today, but just know that the wildfire topic and all the analytical requirements and the policy making, the implementation parts of those requirements, the triggering mechanism went into effect in 2014. And it's basically at the time that a local city or county in those areas updates their next housing element. Of course, January 1, 2014 was about a third of the way through the last housing element cycle. So some jurisdictions already complied with the SB 1241 requirements, and others are just coming into it for the first time as we're now into the sixth housing element cycle. Also related to wildfire, some newer requirements went into effect through SB 379 and SB 1035 to say that same safety element must address community vulnerability and kind of a community's vulnerability to climate change and how communities should be adapting to climate change, the impacts of climate change, the vulnerabilities through goals, policies, and implementation measures. And the triggering mechanism for that is upon the next local hazard mitigation plan update, or also upon the next housing element update. And finally, there are two new bills that passed the legislature in 2019 that sort of added some new, more specific requirements on making sure that a community's evacuation routes are adequate and viable under a range of emergency scenarios, not including but not limited to wildfire, as well as identifying residential areas in the community that don't have at least 2 emergency evacuation routes. So clearly bills that were adopted in the wake of the Camp Fire, the Tubbs Fire, and other sort of catastrophic events where we did see a lot of property loss and the loss of human life as well as a result of inadequate evacuation and ingress and egress. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to hand it off to Betch Hofkes, so our program analyst on the planning team, who's going to walk us through the next part of the presentation. Take it away.
So for OPR's technical advisory update process, we took a very research-driven approach, taking into account the latest thinking on wildfire risk, recent experiences of affected communities, as well as best practices for analyzing hazards and reducing risks. Our technical advisory outlines planning processes, technical studies, tools, outreach and engagement methods, as well that are recommended for wildfire planning. The guiding questions here on this slide highlight a lot of the major themes from our recent technical advisory update. We wanted to ask who should be engaged in the fire hazard planning process, and how do you determine the fire hazards and risks in your jurisdiction? We ask, how can you support populations that are vulnerable to wildfire, and what are specific land use strategies to reduce risk? Finally, our final guiding question was, what examples or resources could help with these efforts? And I'll be walking through these questions in more detail as we continue along. Next slide, please. So local agencies should engage residents, business owners, fire safe councils, and other stakeholders early in the planning process in order to establish an understanding of existing conditions, issues, and community concerns with regard to wildfire. Outreach and engagement efforts should also ensure that vulnerable and disadvantaged communities are properly identified and engaged as part of the fire hazard planning process. Tribal governments should also be consulted, as they have historical knowledge and traditional insight that could really help with protecting cultural resources, as well as allowing for fire mitigation and suppression. In general, with outreach and engagement, it's very important to engage early and often. I'm sure you've heard this before, but we can't stress it enough. And it's also important to work collaboratively, because this can help jurisdictions leverage resources, avoid duplication of efforts, and create a stronger planning document. Next slide, please. As jurisdictions plan for wildfire, they must first determine the fire hazards and risks. Our updated technical advisory identifies statutory requirements for what maps and data must be included in this analysis, but we also provide additional data sources, mapping tools, and guidance around how to characterize these hazards and risks. Our guidance is intended to help jurisdictions identify the intensity and likelihood of hazards, as well as determine the who and what in their community is most vulnerable to wildfire. This assessment should inform the general plan's land use alternatives analysis, as well as the policies and programs that get incorporated into the final plan. Next slide, please. So it's important to recognize that certain groups in our communities are more vulnerable to the impacts of wildfire than others. Both Kate and Eric talked about this earlier. And just to highlight, like in the past, counties have struggled to provide Spanish speakers with timely emergency alerts and information, putting them at risk. Also, elderly residents and persons with disabilities have been less likely to escape fires when events have occurred. Secondary impacts such as wildfire smoke have also had adverse health impacts, particularly on outdoor workers and individuals with underlying health conditions. But through our fire hazard planning process, jurisdictions have an opportunity to identify these vulnerabilities and develop just and equitable solutions. And so there's a lot of opportunity there to support vulnerable populations, and this should be included in the update process. And it's important to align these efforts with environmental justice or climate vulnerability requirements in the general plan where it's applicable. I'm going to pass it back to Eric to talk more about reducing risk to our existing communities.
Thanks, Beth. Alyssa, if we could go to the next slide, please. So we're going to get into a little bit more of the specifics of kind of the guidance on how to address and reduce unreasonable risk. And we've divided up this part of the presentation into things that are facing the existing kind of developed parts of a jurisdiction. And then following this, we'll get up more the new development as for the land use regulatory aspects of the general plan and other planning documents and tools to really get at more of what we think of sort of as a two-phase effort, looking at what's vulnerable on the ground today, and then looking at how to protect and make land use decisions that are protective and have resilience in mind. So In terms of reducing risk to existing communities, I think what we try to do here, and just for the sake of the presentation today, is try to distill our talking points down to sort of 3 buckets. Based on a lot of the work that's being done, a lot of the risks and impacts that we have seen from recent catastrophic events, we know that really we start with retrofitting and protecting what's on the ground today. And a lot of this work, a lot of the work already being done in communities is retrofitting homes, infrastructure. A big focus of this is looking at what's in the WUI that was built prior to our current codes and standards, and what sort of home hardening or infrastructure hardening is needed. And obviously a lot of that work is already being done, but it needs to be done at scale and at a level which we haven't seen. We have noted in our technical advisory in the regulatory section that we have seen some legislative change, some programs being created, such as the AB 38 program, but we still lack a reliable funding source for those types of programs. And so hopefully we'll see a movement in that in the coming years, especially as we get out of our budget crisis and see potentially some improvement from the pandemic and some recovery in the future. But for now, we know that there's still existing challenges that need to be overcome. So looking for those creative funding solutions. Another big piece is implementing what we call landscape management practices for the sake of presentation today. And this covers a whole suite of activities, whether it's fuel modification, vegetation treatments, open space and conservation planning efforts, and implementation practices that really protect and enhance the working lands while also hoping to reduce the hazard severity and reducing risk to adjacent areas. And last but not least, we'll talk a little bit more in coming slides as well about just the human side of all this. Like Beth mentioned, our vulnerable communities. We have a lot of communities on the ground that are very vulnerable to wildfire. And we've seen in recent events that our disadvantaged communities, our elderly populations, non-English speakers, and frankly, our poorer communities suffer the most in wildfire events. So how do we increase community capacity and resilience moving forward? Next slide, please. On the subject of hardening and sort of retrofitting, we have defensible space regulations in place today. We have WUI building codes that require hardening in new construction. But what we're seeing is in a lot of our research and discussions, putting this revised technical advisory together, is these things aren't being done necessarily at scale. We're seeing successes, but also not at the level that we need to be seeing in the WUI today and in some of the adjacent areas. So, a lot of the work does need to be done to get buildings up to code, to do a better job at defensible space regulation, compliance and enforcement efforts statewide and in specific communities. We're also seeing transformation of the regulations themselves, whether we're talking about the current update to the fire safe regulations that CAL FIRE and the Board of Forestry are working on. There was recent legislation passed that creates specific new requirements and a regulatory process coming to look at what we call the structure ignition zone, the very vulnerable part of the structure, the 0 to 5 feet part of a structure. But we also know that some of that work is still to come. So just acknowledging that the regulatory environment is evolving and that general plans and other planning tools can sort of harmonize with existing regulations and may need to change as regulations change as well over time. Next slide, please. On the subject of landscape management practices, I think it's important to point out that fuel modification and sort of just how we manage forests and other landscapes in California need to be a top priority. And some local communities, this is not within their direct control. Some of those adjacent wildlands or vegetated areas may be outside of jurisdictional boundaries. And this is where sort of that interagency kind of multi-stakeholder cooperation is super important. Tools like prescribed burning, which is already mentioned, vegetation removal. Some communities have used grazing practices or herbivory techniques, as they're sometimes called. But the big focus is on, looking at the understory of forests, the grasslands, chaparral, and thinning out that vegetation and doing it in a healthy way that encourages healthy ecosystem management to create fire resilience in the landscape. I did hear one veteran Forest Service employee at a conference say not too long ago that it's not a question of whether there's going to be fire. It's going to be how big it is and when it occurs. So the question really is not what kind of fire, whether there'll be fire, but what kind of fire you want to have. Do you want to have controlled burns and a managed landscape, or do we want catastrophic fire, which takes the entire landscape away with it and homes and communities? So kind of that framework of thinking is doing a better job at managing our resources, knowing that climate change is making these conditions worse, and looking at ways to sort of maximize the benefits of landscape management. And again, this is where the conservation and open space part of a general plan can connect to those activities and really look at land use options that can be more protective in nature. Landscape scale measures, of course, other than the vegetation treatment or the fuel modification itself, other important tools that exist and we see used frequently are fuel breaks, shaded fuel breaks, using agriculture or open space buffers as sort of protective measures to create less vegetation between the developed edge of a community and what we call the wildland areas. So making the WUI and the edges of the WUI more resilient, if you will, by creating those buffer zones. Another big opportunity where local governments have some leverage through the general plan and other implementing plans is through the work that needs to be done to streamline permitting and environmental review. CAL FIRE recently took a very, and the Board of Forestry took an aggressive step forward on this with the California Vegetation Treatment Program and its program EIR. So the leadership the state has shown in at least helping to streamline, taking a step to help streamline permitting and CEQA review for projects are within that treatable landscape of the state responsibility area has been an important step forward. Of course, this doesn't answer all the questions about the local responsibility area or the federal responsibility area. So local governments can, and we provide some connecting points on this, can use the general plan, community wildfire protection plans, and other planning level approaches to identifying the kinds of programs and projects that need to be implemented, and then maybe attempting to cover those plans and implementation plans through some sort of programmatic CEQA review that sort of leverages and borrows from the best practice in the California Vegetation Treatment Program. So we strongly encourage that. And of course, this document is not a CEQA technical advisory per se, so it doesn't lay out a clear roadmap for that, but we definitely refer folks to the Board of Forestry and the Cal VTP program for more information on that. Next slide, please. We talked about reducing risk to existing communities and that human aspect again, and I think a lot of leadership has been shown on this with the Listos California program, which was put forward, has created a lot of success around this of really just getting communities and neighborhoods organized and building resilience, part of a climate resilience strategy, if you will, but also a direct response in the recent years to very specific events where everyone has learned that we need to do better of making sure that our communities across all spectrums, our most vulnerable communities are prepared for wildfire, that they understand it, they understand the threat, that there are needs to know how to evacuate. Where are the evacuation routes? Where are the safe zones in a community for when I can't evacuate? So what are those safe refugia or places where people can gather that are, at least in the interim basis, maybe safer from wildfire than just sitting if you're home if you can't get out and can't get on an evacuation route? How do we begin to prepare communities to recover? What are we going to do about things like temporary housing? So these are the kinds of getting a community prepared for dealing with disaster, and also how to begin to recover equitably and making sure that everyone's needs are met equitably across income, race, and other factors that lead to vulnerability and sort of disadvantaged status in our communities. We also want to make sure that communities are planning for compounding and cascading hazard events such as flooding, landslides, mudslides. Under major catastrophes, we've seen terrible examples of severe water supply contamination, melting plastic pipes, and other environmental needs, like what do you do about removing many, many dead trees? So sort of that debris and removal question has been a big barrier for a lot of communities. So there's a lot to think about in that, but just know that our planning guidance here doesn't just stop at trying to suppress or control or prevent fires. There's a little bit of guidance as well on wildfire-induced problems and how to begin to think holistically about how to mitigate those issues. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to shift over to land use strategies. And I know we're running a bit short on time. We want to make sure we leave time for questions, but this is also a really important part of the guidance. So we want to spend some time here as well before shifting to Q&A. Land use strategies, similar to reducing risk to existing developed areas or communities. The same question we ask, as is required in statute in the safety element, is how can we avoid and minimize what's called unreasonable risk? And this time looking at land use planning and the development review process itself. So the three big buckets here are starting upstream, doing this when you're updating the general plan, not after the general plan is adopted. That's the first big principle. The second big one is developing local solutions that meet local context and locally specific needs and local risk, as opposed to one size fits all approaches. And last but not least, a really important part is the alignment of efforts and the many different plans and sort of codes, standards, and ways that a general plan can be implemented. We want to spend some time focusing on that as well. Next slide, please. In terms of land use strategies, getting specifically on the upstream question, in our review of safety elements and talking with local planners, consultants, fire agencies, CAL FIRE's land use planning program, they're the guys that actually review the safety elements, the mandatory reviews. We're finding that a lot of the general plan work done today on wildfire has focused really just on the end product. It's focused on the policy statements and the programs, but we're finding there hasn't really been a holistic look, or at least not easy to see, a holistic look at the upstream effort of the conversations that happen when a community is updating its general plan, especially looking at land use, looking at the housing element, looking at your site selection criteria for your housing element, for your suitable sites. Using the land use alternatives process to begin to think through what's the best growth pattern for a community moving forward in light of hazards and risks, and beginning to identify land use strategies that can avoid unreasonable risks. So our guidance does talk about some tools and kind of strategies for how that can be accomplished through the land use element update itself, through the use of the land use diagram, through implementing mechanisms that could be embedded into the policy document or implementation programs related to zoning. Of course, the context here again is just super important. We'll get to that again, but the idea is that taking pause to identify the highest hazard parts of the landscape and begin to avoid those. And if avoidance is absolutely not possible, maybe your entire jurisdiction is within a very high fire hazard severity zone, looking at the options that minimize risk to the best that you can. In some communities, infill projects may still be acceptable and appropriate under certain circumstances, so acknowledging that that's the case, but really getting to the place where we're asking the right questions about weighing the cost, benefits, and trade-offs of different land use strategies and different approaches, and what are the impacts of making land use decisions at the general plan scale or the sub-areas planning scale, if you will, as well, about placing development in harm's way. Obviously, in some cases, as is just stated, pure avoidance is not feasible. So the question becomes what safeguards are in place in the policy making and then implementing codes and standards that will reduce risk to the maximum extent feasible. I think another key question is the questions about financial risk. And I know that the insurance industry has been raising the premium prices, in some cases refusing to renew premiums. And I think those are all indicators of the growing hazards and threats that we're seeing. And so is the land use alternatives work being sensitive to that reality? And are we starting to think differently about financial risk and exposure, and what local government can do to sort of begin to mitigate those risks earlier in the planning process through the general plan and its implementation? Next slide, please. So in terms of the specific land use solutions, especially looking at development review procedures, policies that could be in a general plan, or implementing mechanisms like zoning, there's a number of different tools that we use. We borrowed from different best practice bodies. Some of the policy suggestions in the TA are actually new ideas that we didn't really see anywhere else. So trying to create some new thinking around this, but there's been a lot of talk about some communities are already using fire protection planning, or FPPs. There are a few jurisdictions in California where that is a best practice. It's a de facto requirement for when a project is in a higher hazard severity zone. We've also seen communities begin to use overlay zoning, so creating a specific wildfire hazard overlay zones where specific zoning requirements are put in place, whether it's use restrictions, use prohibitions, special standards that should apply, special development restrictions or review requirements. So a lot of different tools there on the kind of the development review and zoning scale. And then in terms of what we call risk reduction measures, there's a whole slew of research and even very recent publications that really speak to the need for the planning scale, kind of the sub-area planning level, larger project level type measures that may not be hardwired yet into codes and standards that are in place. We we have the fire safe regulations that apply to subdivisions in California. We have a building code, the WUI code, and the defensible space. But in some cases, the kind of risk reduction measures that we need to be seeing at the planning scale aren't really codified anywhere. So this is where the general plan can take the initiative through community scale planning to use, again, those managed open space buffers. We've seen a lot of best practice suggested about using roads as fire breaks and only allowing homes on the interior side of roadways. Ridgeline setbacks, slope standards, making sure that the ingress egress requirements are met, in some cases exceeded, where we know that there's higher risk. Fire adapted landscaping standards has come up in a number of cases of being a best practice. I already had mentioned on a prior slide, safe zones or designing the kind of hardened gathering places where people can go in the event of a very fast moving wildfire is another example of building that into to planning. So, all that to say, some of the key things we want people to take away are that it's okay to, in some cases, go above and beyond the state regulations, looking at ways to fill gaps where the state regulations don't appear to set minimum standards or have protective measures in place. So really encouraging communities through the general plan updates or through the implementing programs that implement the general plan to begin to identify and carry out those type of activities. Next slide. Last but not least, want to make sure that folks understand, again, that there's an opportunity through the general plan update process, looking at land use, looking at safety, even maybe when looking at the housing element, to think about how other plans or planning processes can really begin to carry out some of the protective needs for a community as a complement to the general plan. So we have a lot of precedent in California of communities using the Community Wildfire Protection Plan mechanism. That's a federally designed planning program, but it's also an important tool that can be used to kind of look into the specifics of what it takes to do vegetation management, to do the fuel breaks and other activities, especially in the undeveloped parts of a jurisdiction, to begin to address hazards and risk there. The local hazard mitigation plan also, very important that that alignment opportunity is there to look at what the needs are for reducing hazards, the severity of hazards. And of course, both the Community Wildfire Protection and the Local Hazard Mitigation Plan are really important tools to align and prepare a community to receive funding, funding for pre and post disaster mitigation, if you will. And in California, we do have a strong incentive for incorporating plans into the general plan, the Local Hazard Mitigation Plan itself. There is an AB 2140, a law adopted in 2006, a strong incentive for incorporating the Local Hazard Mitigation Plan into the general plan to unlock a state coverage of a local match for a FEMA post-disaster recovery dollars. So very important that folks haven't taken that pathway yet, that they think about that and they think about that alignment opportunity when they're updating their safety element. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Beth, who's going to close out our presentation and the overview before we go to Q&A.
Thank you. So we recognize that OPR is not the first to publish guidance on this topic and that there are a lot of good resources out there already. So in our technical advisory update, we tried to highlight many of these existing resources. Our TA includes example policies and programs, funding sources, guidance documents, tools and data sets, case studies, as well as peer learning and support programs such as the CPAL program, Community Planning Assistance for Wildfire, as well as the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. We are always open to hearing about additional tools that we may have missed, and this will bring us to our next slide, which is that right now our guidance is out for public review. So we encourage you all to take a deep dive into the guidance document that we've shared with you today, read the draft fire hazard planning technical advisory update, see if there's anything that you'd like to add or that got missed. And please review our frequently asked questions document if you have any questions about the TA or want more context for our guidance. And we highly value public engagement and view public review and comment process as an opportunity to develop more thoughtful guidance. So we encourage you to submit your input through OPR's public comment submission form. All public comment will be due by December 18th, 2020. So by the end of this year, December 18th. And we will share the slide deck over email after this presentation. I know that these are hyperlinked in there, so you can't click on them right now, but we will send that out. And you can also find more information on OPR's website. And with that, that brings us to our last slide. So we are going to be opening up for Q&A right now. And we understand that right now we don't have too many questions, but if you do have a question or it comes to you later and it wasn't addressed in this presentation, feel free to send us an email at wildfireta@opr.ca.gov, and we'd be happy to answer your questions. And with that, I encourage you to look at the bottom of your screen at the Q&A feature and submit a question for us. It looks like we have a few questions out there already. The first one is from Jennifer Savage. She says, our safety element is underway. When will fire agencies complete the assessment of neighborhoods with one access?
Yeah, hi, thanks for that question. I believe this question is referring to, there was an AB 2911, the Assembly Bill AB 2911 of the 2018 bill. There was another provision in that bill that required CAL FIRE to conduct an analysis of all subdivisions, like I think it was larger subdivisions in California that didn't have at least 2 points of ingress and egress, and to publish the results of that inventory and to make recommendations to those agencies by July of 2021. So that was the operative year in the statute by which that work was supposed to be completed. I haven't checked in with CAL FIRE on this in a while. I know that they were kind of preparing to begin the work earlier this year, but I can't speak to exactly where they are in the process or what their exact publication date will be. But at least July 2021 was the target date in the statute.
Thank you very much. And our next question comes from Donna Mooney. She says, can you say more about CAL FIRE's program EIR?
Sure. So the program EIR, the name of the program is called the California Vegetation Treatment Program, or CalVTP for short. You'll sometimes hear them call it. And it was developed by the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, the CAL FIRE's advisory or regulatory board. And that EIR is an approach that was developed to kind of look at environmental review requirements for CAL FIRE's vegetation treatment program. So anytime CAL FIRE or other responsible agencies do vegetation management work or fuel modification work in the treatable landscape portion of the state responsibility area, that EIR applies, and that program is covered under that EIR. So projects that are conducted that are consistent with that program EIR, as long as they implement specific standard project requirements, or SPRs they're called, project level environmental review can be streamlined in that case. So that EIR, I believe, was certified about a year ago, and I know that there's been some work that's being done to implement that as well. So, for more information on that, I would suggest going to check in with the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection. They do have a webpage for the CalVTP and its EIR in place.
Thank you so much. And just as a reminder, there is an upvoting feature in our Q&A. So if you do like a question and want that one to rise to the top, feel free to vote it up. Going with the one at the top here, Sohila Bana asks, what if our area, what if our area of the LHMP is from 2011 and not updated? Is there a place to complain about it, and would they be fined?
So local hazard mitigation plans, they're really regulated by FEMA until at the state level, the California Office of Emergency Service, the Governor's Office of Emergency Service plays an oversight role as well. Local hazard mitigation plans are not a mandatory plan. So there's sort of a prospective plan that identifies hazard mitigation strategies for the purpose of mostly federal funding and making sure that there's a strategy in place so that recovery dollars or hazard mitigation dollars are appropriately allocated. Those plans are required to be updated every 5 years. However, I'm not 100% familiar, can't speak to citizen complaints about enforcement or what it looks like to carry out those plans on that level. So that would be probably a really good question for your local agency or for perhaps Cal OES.
Thank you. And our next question comes from Melinda Stavely. She asks, creating a continuum in wildfire defensible space is a great solution. However, it takes additional space in areas that support species. What kind of discussions are happening with California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the regional planning board, et cetera, to ensure that there is a balance between conservation, species protection, and required fuel breaks to protect the urban interface? It is becoming more and more difficult to meet the increasing requirements of these agencies without adding more space that would require modification.
I think that's a great question and comment. I think that the challenge, of course, in fuel modification or vegetation treatment work out in the landscapes is challenging in some cases where we have sort of conflicting regulations in place or perceived conflicts in other cases. And I know that, talking back again about the Cal VTP effort, at least for the state responsibility, that there was a lot of work done to make sure that those impacts and potential impacts from creating a more comprehensive program would be mitigated by imposing sort of the standard project requirements framework, right? So that project level impacts are mitigated, that there's procedures put in place. I know the resource agencies were all at the table through that effort. But this kind of thinking is important. So we don't want to see necessarily conservation and sort of protection of our state's natural working lands and the biodiversity, the habitats and the species we have, that there does need to be a balance in this work. And in some cases, there is a little bit of a trade-off set of questions about, protecting our communities and our landscapes from catastrophic fires, which destroy everything. Or do we need to do some work to maintain the pattern of forests or the pattern of landscape we had pre-settlement, which did include fire and which did include a less dense, maybe forest or grassland or chaparral type environment. So making sure that we're balancing kind of conservation and habitat and species needs with the need to maintain healthier landscapes and protect communities.
Thank you so much for the answer. Our next question comes from Nancy Woltering. She asks, if a jurisdiction's hazard management plan is up to date, does a jurisdiction still need to update the safety element when it updates the housing element?
I'm reading this question one more time to make sure I understand how to answer. So if a jurisdiction's local hazard mitigation plan is up to date, does a jurisdiction still need to update the safety element when it updates the housing element? Okay. So I think what this question may be referring to is some of the different triggering mechanisms that are in play for the safety element. And that the fact that perhaps some local governments and their safety elements do rely on their local hazard mitigation plans to address some of the safety element requirements for addressing hazards. This is an interesting question because it speaks to sort of the procedural requirements for when a plan is linked to the general plan and its safety elements. So, the fact that local hazard mitigation plans are updated every 5 years or so, and that they are often incorporated by reference into the safety element, that incorporation by reference doesn't necessarily travel permanently with each successive update. So when a local agency is updating a local hazard mitigation plan, and they have incorporated or made a decision to incorporate it into the safety element, they need to make sure that that safety element and local hazard mitigation plan maintain consistency, and that is in state law. And if you look at our general plan guidelines, there are requirements for that. Now, some of this is the question is also referencing the housing element, and that's another triggering mechanism for doing the wildfire updates. I think the answer is that yes, that if a local hazard mitigation plan and or the safety element are being updated, they would need to be consistent with each other at the time the housing element is updated.
Thank you so much. And our next question comes from Scott Dripkin. He asks, can the guidance speak towards a coastal community to establish a balance of environmental concerns with public fire safety? For example, working under an LCP.
Yeah, I think that's a good question or a comment as well. We didn't get into a lot of specifics on local coastal plans and how they should or should not address wildfire hazards or risk. I think this is something we could perhaps look into as we respond to public comments and take comments like this into consideration.
Great. And our next question comes from April Saul. She says, it sounds like in talking to colleagues, it has been a bit confusing understanding the CAL FIRE Board of Forestry updates and how and when they will be implementable. Do you have a source you recommend to get the latest status? And similarly, how certain aspects are interpreted, such as the roads and pre-1991 threshold?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a go-to source. I mean, the place I might suggest if I'm not quite sure if this comment is or question is referring to the fire safe regulations update that's currently in process. The contact there would be someone on the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection who's leading that regulatory update. I know that they are doing a series of workshops. There was actually one today that slightly overlapped with the start of our webinar earlier, and they're doing another one, I believe, in the first week of September or December or so. But definitely get in touch with California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection, and I think there is a website for that regulatory updates.
Thank you. And our next question comes from John Duggan. He asks, will the new regulations distinguish between urban and rural development standards?
So just a point of clarification, our technical advisory is not regulatory. It's a set of planning guidance that supplements our general plan guidelines and other guidance that we provide. So I don't know if the question is referring to CAL FIRE's pending regulatory update or if it's referring to our technical advisory. If it is referring to our technical advisory, which is guidance, I would say that we do acknowledge again that context matters and that solutions that look at rural communities that may be entirely within higher fire hazard severity areas, those sets of standards and procedures may look very different from an urban or suburban community where their jurisdiction may include adjacent areas and the outlying areas of their jurisdiction that butt up against the wildland areas or areas with higher fire hazard severity or risk. So we do acknowledge that granularity is important and that local analysis and sort of context setting will really help determine what sorts of standards or approaches should apply.
Thank you. And we have an anonymous attendee that said, the 6th cycle RENA is significantly higher than it has ever been. What role, if any, does OPR or CAL FIRE play in the housing projections for the RENA program? This RENA cycle is forcing many jurisdictions to build significantly more housing into very high fire hazard severity zones. What do you suggest to these jurisdictions that are now required to plan for thousands and even tens of thousands of additional units while still ensuring safety in the significant increase in population and traffic?
Yeah, I think this is the million-dollar question that we've been hearing a lot about lately. And I think that there is sensitivity.
I'm happy to jump in after you on this one as well.
Oh yeah, sure, Kate. I'll just start by saying I think there is sensitivity to that reality that we do have a need to build more housing in California. I think there are concerns and valid concerns that maybe local agencies, as they're getting their allocations, are having trouble finding suitable sites for that housing. But I think that the way that if you read our updated technical advisory, I mean, there's an acknowledgement that we need to build more housing, but we need to put it in the right places. And we believe that the analyses that can be done through the wildfire hazard and risk assessment, doing your climate vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy, that the framing outcomes of those analyses should be helpful in identifying the sort of land use strategies, site selection criteria, and other planning tools that can really guide housing and new development into the right places. And again, as I mentioned in my presentation, we acknowledge that in some cases, an entire jurisdiction could be in a very high fire hazard severity zone, and they may still have a need to build more housing. So that's a different context than let's say a suburban community where only 10% of the land or 20% is in a very high fire hazard severity zone, where that community may have more options for avoiding hazard or reducing risk. So it looks different depending on the context. And I think that's the message I want to send is we acknowledge this is challenging, but we're in an environment where the catastrophes we're seeing are greater than anything we've ever seen, and there's a need to take care in where we plan and where we decide to put housing.
Thanks. I'm going to join on that. I agree with everything Eric said. We'll add that we at OPR are involved in the next update of the RENA, and so we're going to be thinking about balancing all of these different priorities. We also, as folks probably know, run the state climate resilience program, ICARP, and so one of the things we're also balancing is the role that undeveloped land plays as a fire break, as a wetland, a flood reducer through wetlands preservation. So there's a lot of opportunity to think about the different role that types of land have, whether it's developed or undeveloped. So we're doing work on, sorry for the noise, we're doing work on that update, and we are thinking about all these different competing interests. We're very focused on making it easier to do compact development, not in high fire risk zones. That's a high priority for the governor and for our office.
Thank you very much. So our next question comes from Bob Brown. He said, local agencies are often left on their own to address conflicting policies with state agencies. It should be state agencies' responsibility to work out those conflicts so it isn't placed on local agencies. Can you help with today's topic?
Well, I think it's a great comment, and we do look for those opportunities, like Kate mentioned, in the work that we're involved with. You know, we can take the RENA process as another good example, where I think there is increasing need to coordinate and align across agencies to make sure that we don't have conflicting policies to the extent possible, and really to make sure that funding priorities, you know, alignment of policy, reinforcing kind of the outcomes we want to see, is our job. So that is one of OPR's duties. And so we do that coordination and alignment work. And as we were updating this technical advisory, we tried to take some of that into consideration and framing approaches that do align certain benefits and policies, but there's always going to be cases where conflict could arise. So you know, we're happy to take specific comments on that if you bring those to us as we think about the next revision of this technical advisory. If there's ways that in this advisory we can address those conflicts more specifically in guidance, we're happy to try to do that.
Thank you. So we have 1 minute left, and there's a few questions here that have been left unanswered. But if you have questions that are not addressed right now and you really want an answer, you can send an email to wildfireta@opr.ca.gov, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that get left unanswered. With that, I would like to see if Eric has any closing comments. And I'm also going to provide a link in the chat for all attendees so that you can see where to find our updated guidance and all of our relevant FAQs.
Yeah, thank you so much, Beth. And thanks to everyone who participated today, who attended and asked some good questions. We are hoping that folks will review and comment on this draft technical advisory update. It is a public review draft, so the ink isn't dry. We still have a few, we know we have more work to do, and that's why we are seeking public input and feedback. So please do send us your comments, and like Beth said, there's a specific link where we'd like you to submit comments, and happy to answer any questions that are emailed to the email address shown on the screen. So with that, I'll just say thank you so much for coming to the webinar today. If you haven't yet, I would ask folks to, if you haven't yet, do sign up for our e-notifications lists. I know that it is on our homepage of our website. If you look under e-lists at the top of the banner, we do send out e-blasts and notifications on future webinars, announcements about documents we're releasing, funding opportunities, and other actions that we're taking across the agency. So definitely sign up for our e-list, and especially the general announcements if you haven't yet, to stay informed and engaged on the work we're doing. So with that, thank you so much for attending the webinar today, and hope you have the great rest of your day. Thanks.